Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Black Baseball Mixtape, and this is Mixtape Talk. And we are about to make history, I believe. I believe we're about to make history because this is the first time on the Black Baseball Mixtape that we have two white dudes as our guests. I'm really, really excited about this, and it is so awesome. I wouldn't have it any other way. Jay Caldwell and my buddy Graig Kreindler is here. They are collaborating on an amazing, amazing piece of art. I mean, it's a book, but it's an amazing piece of art called Black Baseball in Living Color. It will be released in December. It is in pre-order right now, but it is a massive amount of work and awesomeness dedicated to Negro League Baseball and Negro League Baseball history. And it is fitting that I have both Jay and Greg on the show. Welcome to the Black Baseball Mixtape.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, great to see you, Mark.
Great to see you, Greg. Great to see you. Jay, I'm going to start with you because
Okay.
I know that this project, and doing a little bit of my research, I know that the book project kind of was birthed out of what was a exhibit, a Negro League Baseball exhibit that was on display for the Centennial. I know Greg has been working on it for a long time in regards to the portraits and the color studies. But Jay, how did this project come together for you and for everybody involved?
Well, I think kind of a short answer for the portraits is I got inspired by my children to start a project where I could bring some aspect of baseball that was only seen in black and white into color. And through a mutual friend, Monty Sheldon, I got introduced to Craig and started discussing it with him. And I think over 4 years, 240 portraits later, we were ready for the exhibit at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And that occurred in 1920, and then again this year, beginning in May. And
so it's 2020, right?
2020.
All right, 1920 is the start of some important. It's an important date in Negro League history, but in 2020 as the centennial, and that's when it started, right?
That's correct. And then I did sometime in, I think it was May or June, a book got released by SABR on the Chicago American Giants. And they had requested that they could use certain of Greg's paintings for the book. And I gave him permission. And in the course of doing that, started talking to the main editor, Bill Nolan, and said, why don't we, rather than just doing this piecemeal, I'm going to do a book with all of Greg's Negro Leagues paintings. And that started in, as I recall, early July. And here we are in November, and it's at the printers trying to get it printed.
And Jay, let's be clear, because this is a very ambitious project for you. You're not an author in that sense. So this is your first book, correct?
This is my first book. That's correct.
So where did, I mean, obviously you've been involved in the project, and you see SABR, for those that don't know, that's the Society of American Baseball Research, correct? Am I saying that correctly? Mm-hmm. They're producing a book. But what convinced you that, hey, it's time for me to see if I can put together a whole book on all of Greg's work, and we'll talk about Greg's work in a second.
Okay. Well, it was an idea that's always been percolating in my mind, and I just felt the time was right. I was kind of inspired by this Chicago Americans Giants book, and recruited a few authors from SABR to help me out with the book. And there are 12 chapters, and I think I wrote 4 of them, and the others, put together the other 8.
That's fantastic. Greg, when I believe we talked about 1.5 years, 2 years ago or so, maybe earlier than that actually, but when we talked, I remember it was crunch time. And it was you were telling me about kind of the final days of the portrait project, because I'd gotten wind of the portrait project and I was fascinated with it. For those not familiar, tell the world and people what exactly the Negro League Portrait Project was for you, and like how you were able to put together so many color studies of Negro League players that, just to be frank, a lot of people just aren't familiar with, never saw a picture of, and didn't know anything about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it to say that it was kind of like, you know, the highlight of my career, I guess you would call it, so far. I mean, that's kind of an understatement because, I as kind of like a historian or a visual historian, I try to kind of pride myself on knowing a lot about baseball, or at least knowing a lot of, weird, esoteric stuff about how uniforms looked and stadiums looked and players looked. But when it came to the Negro Leagues, I knew very little. I mean, I was kind of exposed to that through Ken Burns' documentary. I'd see like Spike Lee wearing, a Monarchs jersey, and I'm like, what is that? But yeah, it was just amazing opportunity. When I met Jay, he, kind of approached me with just kind of an idea that blossomed into this mammoth project. And the opportunity to kind of, learn about these players, to kind of live with them in a way, it was just something that I never kind of expected to be able to do. It was basically through Jay, through a lot of memorabilia collectors, through historians, through kind of my own research, that I was able to come up with the photography to base the portraits on. But in addition to that, there was also the uniforms and trying to kind of get not only the look of those right, but the colors right, which is kind of what I strive for. I know, we talked about historical accuracy or whatever the last time that we chatted.
Sure.
And even now, it's kind of like I can look at these portraits and still kind of question whether I got a little detail right here, right there. And unfortunately, unlike the white leagues, there's very little information out there about that stuff. I mean, Mark Okinen and the people at the Hall of Fame have this great database of baseball uniforms back to 1900, and then there's another fellow named Craig Brown who goes even further back to the 1800s, and it's all from the white leagues, and we don't have anything like that for the Negro Leagues. So in a way, this was kind of like an opportunity to tap into that a little, not necessarily make the same kind of database, but try to visualize that history as best as we could.
How many color studies was it when you finished, and how long did it take?
It was by the end, Jay, it was 238.
239.
239.
Wow.
Yeah, 239 5x7 portraits. Jay, we chatted first, was it 2015 or 16? I don't remember.
I think it was 16.
Maybe 16. Okay.
Wow.
So 2016. So yeah, 4 years. I mean, I was literally finishing up the last few portraits
I remember that part.
at the beginning of January of 2020. And the show was going to open like a month and change later. So it took a while.
He was doing like one a week on average.
Right. And not to mention, and I remember at the time we talked, it was, you were doing this, but this was also, you had like a lot of stuff. You had like the backlog of just other kind of commissions and pieces of work that you had to do was also, kind of in the back burner. You said most, I guess, patrons understood. That was like, hey, I'm working on this massive thing. We'll have to put a delay on certain things, but that's phenomenal. 239 in about 4 years. That's amazing. And since the exhibit, because the book that is going to be released in December is so exciting, and that's one thing. But we were just kind of chit-chatting off the air about all of the other. There's so many ancillary kind of addendum type things that have come since the exhibit, since you guys have worked together to make the exhibit happen. That has to be kind of mind-blowing and phenomenal on itself, correct?
Yeah.
Well, you go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I've been blown away that it's been able to have the kind of reach that it has. That so many people have been picking up on this stuff. Whether it's through the museum show or the baseball cards or stuff they see online, and it's just kind of, I think it's promoting interest in those leagues and those players, which is really, I mean, that's all I want. I know Jay kind of probably feels similarly. But yeah, he tells his own story, I suppose.
Well, it has led to so many things. One thing we were chatting about earlier was the Negro League Celebration beer that was brewed by Main and Mill Brewing Company. That is something I don't think had ever been done before, not with specific players on the cans, as opposed to just a generic player representation. So that was one thing. We're currently working, nothing finalized yet, but currently working with Hinchliffe Stadium to help them open their museum there. Hinchliffe being one of 5 Negro Leagues parks that's still in existence.
Absolutely. It's the oldest, I believe, right?
What's that?
It's the oldest that's still in existence, right? Or it was. Did it? I don't know if they stopped.
I think the Birmingham Black Baron Stadium is older, but it's up there.
It's older than I am.
So hopefully they'll open next year, and hopefully we'll be a part of that.
That's awesome.
And I know there's at least 2 documentaries that we're getting involved in that hopefully we'll release next year, and Craig's portraits will be part of that, and I won't be seen.
Well, Jay, let me ask this, and before we go even further in details of the book, but is it fair to say that a lot of this Negro League baseball history is is it fair to say it's kind of having a moment? And I say that because we talked about the centennial. Unfortunately, a lot of that was marred by the pandemic at the time, but the leadership of Bob Kendricks over at the museum has been phenomenal. I have seen in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 to 4 years, more recognition, more acknowledgement, even with Major League Baseball acknowledging statistics of the Negro Leagues as major leagues. The centennial celebration, all of the things that you guys are working on with big exhibits. Is it fair to say that I know as a hat collector, and I've seen more Negro League releases and products that have just been really, really awesome. Is it fair to say this is a special time for kind of Negro League historians?
I think it really is. I think there was a core group of historians who were very dedicated and who brought a lot of knowledge, but it never really got the play that it did until 2020 with the centennial. And I think 2 things that, and some of this is self-serving, 2 things that really set it off was the card set that we did with Graig's artwork. That came at a time also with the pandemic where everybody was trapped at home and looking for things to do. And as you probably know, baseball cards exploded.
Had an explosion.
Value and collection. And we hit the timing perfectly for that. And then the second one that really accelerated was Major League Baseball recognition of the Negro Leagues as major leagues. And people started wanting to know, well, who are these guys? And you can find old card sets that are generally black and white and kind of crude drawings. And some, like say, Dick Perez's artwork, which is phenomenal, his Hall of Fame series, which had the players in the Hall of Fame at that point in color and very well done. But there was nothing of the scope of what Graig had created. And so that helped visualize a lot of this and helped people understand the words that were being written.
I think you're exactly right. I think indeed. So, I mean, and since then, there's just been, I believe, like I said, an acceleration of just really cool stuff that is Negro League related that's happened. I'm locked into like podcasts now that are talking, like the Black Diamonds podcast is talking about Negro League history all the time, and it's such interesting stuff. And so one thing I wanted to ask, there's several things I want to ask about the book because it is really, really amazing. But you decided, Jay, to kind of make certain chapters about, I want to say it was 5 Negro League players.
That is correct.
And we know, Satchel Paige is a chapter. I believe you wrote the Satchel Paige chapter. Jackie Robinson, Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell. Tell me a little bit about how you decided of all of the players that have just amazing stories when it comes to the Negro Leagues and what they had to go through. How did you settle on the 5 that you settled on, and kind of went about putting those in the book, telling those stories in the book?
Well, this was actually part of a grand scheme, including with the celebration, because Craig created multiple images of those players. And the idea behind it was that Paige, Gibson, and Bell represented 3 aspects of Negro League baseball in pitching, power, and speed that they were synonymous with. And it made a good story just for how the game developed with the Negro Leagues. You couldn't ignore Rube Foster, the founder of the Negro National League. He did more to get the Negro Leagues on an organizational basis than anyone else. He was a great player, and he actually tried to integrate baseball several times before founding the Negro National League. So he was just a story all by himself, and deserved his own chapter. And then, of course, Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier, spent very little time in the Negro Leagues, only part of one season, I think something like 35 games that we have records of. But he was the transition to integrating baseball. And so we spent a lot of time with him, and actually have portraits of him, not only with baseball, but with football, basketball, going back to when he was like 10 years old. So kind of a life history for Jackie Robinson.
That's fantastic. And correct me if I'm wrong, you wrote some of the chapters. You wrote, I know, the Satchel Paige chapter, but it was also an effort for you to collect, I guess, different authors and editors and make this thing happen. Tell me a little bit about the idea behind making it a true collaboration.
Yeah, well, I relied heavily on Bill Nolan, the editor, who oversaw the editing process. But yes, I contacted a number of people, asked if they were in, and everybody was enthusiastic about doing it. I probably could have asked another 20 people and had 20 more yeses. But the people who did it, we just divided up the chapters after, based on their own interests, and tried to get, I think my main role after just assigning people chapters was trying to give them a sense of what we wanted to accomplish, so that there was not as much overlap as you might think there would be when you bring other people in it, especially given how quickly it happened. But we got the people involved and kind of told them what we were trying to highlight and how we were trying to present their story, and then they put it in their own words. And as you read the book, you'll find that there are different takes on various subjects, but I think that adds to the diversity of the story we're trying to tell, because it is opinion based, a lot of it, and I think it comes across very well.
And it's interesting that you say kind of difference of opinions. I think you have a chapter or an intro in the book that's kind of like myth. I think it's called like myth versus kind of when doing this research, there's so many legends, and the legends sometimes, if you tell a legend long enough, sometimes most people believe it to be true. And so what are some of the things that you found in your research that was, kind of widely misunderstood about the Negro Leagues?
Okay, well, part of it has to do with just the players themselves and the legends around the players. And the two most popular legends, I think, are about Satchel Paige, who I consider the greatest pitcher who ever lived. And you will see people, I think, sincerely saying, well, he won 2,500 games, major league equivalent games. Well, he didn't. Most of the games, he may have pitched that many, and maybe he actually theoretically won that many. But most of his games, because he pitched every day, if they weren't in the Negro Leagues, they were like 3-inning exhibitions, which wouldn't qualify for a win. He might have left the game with the lead intact, but somebody else, pitched the rest of the game. Another example is very common is Josh Gibson, who either had 800 home runs or 960 home runs in a very short career. He couldn't possibly have hit that many, and in the Negro Leagues he has fewer than 200 home runs. But that doesn't take away from the fact that he was an incredibly powerful hitter and the leading slugger of the Negro Leagues. And would have been a tremendous star in the major leagues if he had been allowed to play. But what my emphasis is on is trying to take away some of the myths and look at them as real people, and so that you see how great they were as real people. They don't need the legends anymore. There was a time that they did, but I don't think they do anymore.
I think one of my favorite I guess I don't know if it's a story, and I don't know exactly how I came across the story, but it was the fact that Jackie Robinson was a Kansas City Monarch, and Kansas City was owned by, correct me if I'm wrong, is it J.R. Wilkins or J.L. Wilkins?
J.L. Wilkinson.
J.L. Wilkinson, who happened to be one of the white owners. There were white owners in the Negro League, and he was a white owner of the Kansas City Monarchs. So when Branch Rickey basically steals Jackie Robinson from the Monarchs through the Dodgers, kind of over the cover of night, right? One of the things that was so fascinating to me was JL really couldn't put up a huge fight, because at the time, they were at this time, the black press, black fandom, black media was like, somebody has to go, somebody has to break this thing. And so the pull was for integration in the league and have a player do it. And so JL basically couldn't stand in the way of Branch Rickey and couldn't get compensation. I just found that, because he was a white guy. And that was, if it hadn't been a black, it had been Effa Manley or someone else, at least compensation would have been on the table. But I remember the idea that JL could not put up a fight, could not really say anything, could not take act, because he would be viewed as the white guy stopping progress in all of baseball. That was just a fascinating story that I never thought of.
Yeah, well, JL was, I think, willing to do it. His partner and co-owner of the Monarchs, Thomas Baird, was less willing to do it, but came around. And this is one of those dichotomies of the unfortunate segregation of Branch Rickey, who obviously deserves accolades for bringing Jackie Robinson in, also considered the Negro Leagues, as he said, something of a criminal enterprise, which is why he wouldn't compensate him. Effa Manley, who you mentioned, was strident about getting compensated for her players,
right?
And when Larry Bodie left Newark Eagles for Cleveland, Bill Veeck did compensate Effa. So it's one of those, you're a good guy and a bad guy at the same time. and
you let history judge.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think there was a good. I think there's rumors where there's a good chance that it wouldn't have been Jackie Robinson had it been, because it was Monty Irvin and Larry Doby were over on the and the word was Monty Irvin was probably the best player in the leagues at the time.
He was, and one of my favorite quotes, and it's unfortunate, is he was selected, or he was the favorite of the players and the owners to integrate the major leagues. but as he said, he entered World War II as a 400 hitter and left as a 300 hitter.
Right.
And so the delay in his period of service in the World War II and the diminishment of skills affected that.
Mm-hmm. Graig, you were learning a lot as you were doing all of these portraits. You were learning a lot about the background of the players and the stories that were involved. What's one? Is there a story that stands out for you as like the most just kind of obscure, weird? Like, I need to learn more about this person.
Oh man, I mean, there are a lot. It's hard to pick one. They're like, even some of them are kind of like, for a casual researcher, if you're just kind of looking up some of these guys on Wikipedia, you can learn about them. But like someone like oh God, like Ghost Marcel, having his nose bitten off, Dave Brown murdering someone, just like insane stuff that it's, in a way, like it kind of adds to stuff like that, adds to the flavor in a way of the painting, like in my head at least, but it's still kind of my goal to, depict those men and women kind of as honestly as possible. And that, I think that's kind of why Jay and I work really well together. I mean, aside from the fact that, we both have very similar senses of humor, but, the fact that he kind of wants to take the myth out of it and present, the facts, I guess, or as many of the facts as we know. And that's kind of what I strive to do too. But there were so many odd and also, really tragic, colorful stories. It's hard to kind of pick one as being the best, but I don't know, maybe Ghost Marcel having his nose bitten off it's gotta be.
I don't know the story. How do you get his nose bitten off?
Oh, Jay, you tell this better than I do.
Oh, well, I actually just wrote a blog about Ghost Marcel on my book website, baseballartllc.com. Mm-hmm. But the short version of the story is Marcel was a tremendous player. But he was also a heavy drinker and had a hair trigger temper and very violent. And in a card game with Frank Warfield, he got into an argument over a gambling debt. $5 apparently is what the amount of the money at dispute was. And he pulled a knife on Warfield. Warfield, and he grappled, roll around, and Warfield bit off a part of his nose.
Oh, geez.
And at the end of the day, Warfield ended up in jail, and Marcel ended up in the hospital.
Oh.
But that put along with the heavy drinking, put an end to Marcel's career, because Marcel was a very handsome man. He would have been a movie star in another year. But he just couldn't stand the abuse and shame of the heckling that went on with having to wear a patch on his nose.
That's insane.
We looked, the two of us looked, and I don't think that we could ever find any photographic, evidence of him with the eye patch on his nose. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, because it obviously did, but perhaps it's one of those things where he just did not want to be seen or photographed or whatever, or it's been lost to time, but it kind of like adds to that mystique of that crazy story.
So this isn't baseball related, but it's just recent, and I had to I took to Twitter the other day, because have you guys seen the commercial? There's a Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield commercial where they're selling like ears. They're sitting together, they're selling ears, and I think it's like an edible product, whether it's a like a gummy ear or something. And literally I'm watching this, and I take to Twitter, and I'm like freaking. I was like, is anybody else uncomfortable with this? like I don't know what Evander Holyfield's situation is, but it's got to be down bad to do a commercial with Mike Tyson, and they're selling ears, and it's like it's insane. But hearing that story definitely reminds me of that. And Jay,
History repeats itself.
I've got to ask, because you have a chapter in the book that's dedicated to the Latin Winter Leagues.
Mhm.
And if there is an aspect of Black baseball and kind of Negro League baseball around that time that I'm probably least familiar with, I know that Black players were able to go to, go out of the country, go to different places and play. But tell us a little bit about that chapter, how it came about, because it was such a big part of Negro League history, especially the early years. And I like I said, I don't think a lot of people are familiar with the Latin Winter Leagues as much.
Well, the Latin Winter Leagues did several things. It allowed the Negro Leagues players, the American players, to play year round, which boosted their income, got them helped develop their skills. They've made friendships with Cuban and Dominican players who then came to the U.S. It really helped the development of the Negro Leagues as well as the players. But to me, the real interesting aspect of it is Cuba had a very similar history of in the country with slave trade. Many more slaves were brought to Cuba than there were to the U.S. And they had segregated baseball. And the segregated baseball ended in 1900 with the overthrow of Spain, because the Black population and the white population fought together to overthrow Spain. And because of that shared sacrifice, they made the decision to integrate baseball in 1900. And that decision was made a little bit easier when the all-Black team that entered the league that year actually won the pennant. And so everybody else immediately started signing Black players. But to me, that was a fascinating aspect of how the Negro Leagues players, the American players, started going to Cuba and eventually throughout the Caribbean.
And for somebody that's kind of watching this now and listening now, was it easier to travel to Cuba back then? Or because obviously in my lifetime, I've lived in a large period where people didn't go to Cuba. They didn't travel to Cuba.
It was easier to go. In fact, a lot of times people didn't even have passports. Passports were kind of a recommendation, not a requirement.
Right.
But yeah, the Negro Leagues players love going to Cuba and to the Dominican and to Mexico because they were treated like everyone else. They weren't second-class citizens, and they really enjoyed it. In most cases, there are a few cases where it seems like they didn't like the food. The food was unsettling to them. So, like Satchel Paige is probably the best example of that. You don't find much of a record of Satchel Paige in the Caribbean because it unsettled his stomach.
Wow, that's amazing. Let me ask before we close here, but I'm always fascinated about the end of the Negro Leagues in general. And so we know Jackie integrated in 47. Players started coming in kind of immediately after that. I think I read by basically 54, 55, it was basically over, right? Like the Negro Leagues had kind of just been then hollowed out. What is it about that time period that stands out to you? Like, because it's got to be almost like, I don't know if it probably feels like a fast moving ship, but was it a slow moving ship towards the end after Jackie integrated? How did the owners try to kind of hold on? And there were still some younger players, like I don't know, Willie Mays was still coming up around that time. But I'm always fascinated about the end. And when did the owners really realize it was over? Was it when kind of Jackie and Larry Doby integrated, or did they think they could hold on for a little bit longer?
Well, I think that they actually realized it was over before Jackie Robinson integrated. Because one of the last real pressures of the Negro Leagues was the Mexican Baseball League, run by Jorge Pascal, started recruiting Negro Leagues players and white major league players to play in Mexico, and he was offering them higher salaries, better living conditions. They traveled by train, and they only played on weekends. It was a great life. And Major League Baseball was under threat from Mexico. And at one point, nearly 40% of the Negro Leagues players from the early 1940s were playing in Mexico. And it was a summer league. It wasn't like, the Cuban Winter League. This was a summer league. So they were already under pressure. The end was, the end was obviously coming. I would think it was a trickle. I think you can see that in the number of players that made it into the major leagues. They're generally, I would say, two dates that are generally given for when the Negro Leagues were over, but not quite over. So now we generally consider the end of the Negro Leagues 1948. And anything beyond that is kind of a diminished league. 1960 marked the end. There was only between 1948 and 1960, there was only the Negro American League. And by 1960, they had stopped a regular schedule of games. And then barnstorming continued, I think, as late as 1967. But, 1960 to 1948 and 1960 are kind of the two dates I would say most commonly given as when the Negro Leagues ended.
And what ended barnstorming? Was it just salaries? Because that was reading about the history and knowing about that time period of baseball. That seems so exciting. Like it seemed like all-star teams going around the country playing games at different stadiums. It just seemed cool. Like
it did. I think that's a good question, and I think I've never done any research on this, but I think the major thing, barnstorming was popular because it was profitable, and you were bringing entertainment to people who generally didn't see professional entertainment. I think what really ended it was TV and widespread radio, because now they could see baseball at top levels in their home, even if you lived in, Kearney, Nebraska.
Yeah.
You could watch the New York Yankees. That wasn't the case when barnstorming was in its heyday.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot. I think the last major kind of NBA work stoppage lockout, I just remember there were all of these like NBA player led pickup games. So you'd see like, LeBron and Kevin Durant's team is playing James Harden. And I just remember thinking like, it was like modern day barnstorming. They didn't have the league at the time to play. I think, they figured it out, but it was like this really cool thing where they just got a bunch of like players and they would go to like, outdoor courts in these large crowds. And I've always read, and I think certain players like Bob Feller and those guys made more money in their barnstorming tours than they would on their Major League Baseball salaries. So it was like something almost out of necessity that they had to do. And we always mention Satchel Paige, and Satchel Paige is like, he's already in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but if there was a barnstorming Hall of Fame, Satchel Paige would be the architect, right? The architect of this. So, gentlemen, this is phenomenal. It's really, I've already pre-ordered the book. I know people can pre-order the book and learn more about the book. Where at, Jay? Tell us where kind of everybody can find everything.
Okay. You can find it at baseballartllc.com. That's the website we set up for the book. And again, it's baseballartllc.com.
And Jay, this is, I noticed in some of the bios, it says this is the first collection. Should we expect more of this type of work as we move forward?
I'm hoping. I've got several ideas and I'm starting to work on some. So well, we're trying to move forward.
That's awesome. Graig, I follow all of your accounts, so it's like I'm already like stalking. I was for weeks and months on end. I would like send Graig random tweets and be like, "Hey, like do a Willie Mays doodle on a napkin and just send it to me because he's so amazing." Graig, you've got so much going on. What's new in your world? What's next? What are you working on?
Well, I've got a couple of painting. Oh, no, I shouldn't say a couple. I have a lot of paintings I'm trying to finish. One that I'm currently trying to get done before the holiday is it's a painting of Tim Anderson hitting the home run at the Field of Dreams
How
game.
cool.
So I'm trying to finish that up. And I've got a lot of other, like, in addition to like the normal, Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle stuff, I've gotten a lot of interesting, Negro League and Latin American League commissions lately, where I'm doing this action shot of Pete Hill for a client this image that I've always wanted to do. Doing one of Meito Navarro and Pancho Coimbre for another client, and like that stuff I really get excited about because I think it's kind of I was able to do that because of the stuff that I've done with Jay. So it's kind of like, it's almost like a continuation of that project for me. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm posting stuff on social kind of every day, whether it's progress on a painting or commemorating someone's birthday, or if I'm just complaining about how tired I am from being a parent or whatever.
It's so cool. It's so cool.
Now, Mark, I should tell you that I recently responded to a post that Graig made and said, "Well, you're ready to make 100 more." And he told me to lose his number. So this may be the last time Craig and I talk.
But that's a fascinating question. Out of 239, like how many more what's the opportunity for more color stories? What's the opportunity for more portraits and more pictures? Because I mean, I'm assuming you did everything you could, right?
I think we did everything that we could do in that time span. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, but I think if we had another year, I feel like there'd be maybe another 50 guys that we would have done.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, because no list that either of us could have come up with, or any historian could have come up with, would have been complete. I mean, I'm sure that there are people that that we did, that I painted, that people might think don't deserve to be in there, and people who they think deserve to be in there who might not have been included. So every kind of everyone's different. If it were up to me, I would just paint these guys for the rest of my life until they're all done. But
it's got to be a thing where you just kind of keep finding new ones, right? Like someone says, "Oh, my great uncle played in the Negro Leagues." Here's what I mean, and it's just like, well, gentlemen, this has been phenomenal. I'm so excited about the book that is coming out in December, right? It should be, you can pre-order now, and it'll hopefully hit us before the holiday season. So perfect timing once again. So. Everything that you guys are doing is exciting and phenomenal. And if there's anything that we over at the Black Baseball Mixtape can do to help, please do not hesitate to ask. So thank you both.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for having us.
Oh no, it's my pleasure. It is Jay and Graig, and this is the Black Baseball Mixtape. This is Mixtape Talk, and until next time, we see it.
Thank you.